In 1982, a French genealogist named Pierre Plantard made a startling discovery. In the basement of the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, he opened a steel filing cabinet. Inside, carefully wrapped in oilcloth, was a collection of ancient parchments dating all the way back to 1244. These documents contained something quite extraordinary, something that, according to established beliefs, shouldn't even exist. It was a complete family tree, traced maternally, following surnames, village records, and church registries. This lineage led back to a woman identified only as M. de Bethany Epis, or Mary of Bethany, wife. But what was truly remarkable was that the family tree didn't end with her. It continued forward through 13 centuries of European history. The line was carried by daughters whose names appeared in various historical records, parish registries, marriage contracts, even inquisitorial interrogations. Then, around 1307, the trail suddenly went cold. But not because the bloodline ended. It was because someone had deliberately tried to erase it from history. This wasn't just some legend or folktale. This was documented evidence. The moment these documents came to light, the Vatican issued a formal denial, preemptively, before anyone had even raised a question. Why this immediate defensiveness? Because if this bloodline was genuine, it would completely overturn the very foundations of Christian authority. It would mean that Jesus of Nazareth didn't die without offspring. It would mean that his legacy wasn't merely a spiritual concept, but a biological continuation, a family. And it would mean that for 2,000 years, powerful institutions had been at war with a family whose only offense was their very birthright. The evidence, surprisingly, doesn't begin in Jerusalem, but in southern France, in a village called S. Marie de la Mer. Local oral tradition, a story that predates all written Gospels, recounts that 3 women arrived by boat in the year 42 AD. These women were Mary Salome, Mary Jacobi, and Mary Magdalene. They weren't just fleeing persecution, they were protecting something precious. Parish records from the 11th century describe Magdalene as the one who carried a secret within her womb. In 1448, a monk named Brother Etienne was ordered by the Bishop of Marseille to remove this specific phrase from all copies of the village chronicle. He obeyed the order. However, in his personal journal, which was discovered in 1989, he wrote, "I have been commanded to erase what everyone already knows." What everyone supposedly knew was that Magdalene had children, and those children had names. In 1954, archaeologists excavating a Merovingian burial site near Rennes-la-Tau unearthed an ossuary, a stone container for bones, inscribed with the name Sarah. Carbon dating placed the ossuary in the 1st century AD. Inside were the remains of a young woman, between 18 and 25 years old, along with a single gold ring engraved with a phrase in Aramaic, "Daughter of the Anointed, Sarah." This is the same name that appears in Provençal legends as Sarah Lally, the dark saint, who was said to be the daughter Magdalene bore before fleeing Judea. This wasn't a myth. It was biology contained within a stone box, and the pattern continues. Between 1200 and 1320, a specific surname appears repeatedly in notarial records across Languedoc, Provence, and Catalonia, Demdal of Magdala. The name turns up in wills, dowries, property transfers, and even a chilling document. A papal decree from 1215 ordering the Archbishop of Narbonne to investigate and report all families claiming descent from Magdalene, so they could be known to Rome, not protected, but known. This wasn't about theology, it was about surveillance. In 1244, the Cathar fortress of Montour fell after a 10-month siege. The Cathars weren't considered heretics because of their religious beliefs. They were heretics because they claimed to be protecting something the Church had tried to destroy, the direct descendants of Christ, hidden among them, living under assumed names. When the fortress was burned, 225 Cathars were executed. However, 4 individuals escaped the night before the surrender, carrying what Inquisition testimony referred to as the treasure of the faith, which was not gold. 3 weeks later, in the village of Aix-les-Thermes, an inquisitor named Bernard Dau interrogated a woman named Esclarmonde de Voir. Under torture, she confessed, "We protected the daughters. They are the treasure." She was burned alive the next morning. Her testimony was sealed in the Vatican archives for 700 years. In 1307, on Friday, October 13th, the Knights Templar were arrested across France on charges of heresy. The official accusations were blasphemy and idol worship, but in the interrogation records of Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master of the Order, a different motive emerges. He was asked, "Did the Order protect a bloodline?" He responded, "We protected what Rome tried to murder." He was burned at the stake 6 months later. Before his death, he cursed King Philip IV and Pope Clement V. Both were dead within a year. But what's most important is what de Molay said next. It was recorded by a scribe and later erased, but recovered through ultraviolet imaging in 1971. "The daughters are already in the north. You will never find them all." The north. Between 1310 and 1350, there's a sudden surge of women with the surnames Mordin, Melina, and Magdalena appearing in marriage contracts across Scotland, Flanders, and the Rhine Valley. They marry into noble families, merchant families, and craft guilds. Then, in 1348, as the Black Death ravages Europe, something extraordinary occurs. In the parish records of Bruges, a priest named Jan van der Heyden writes, "Many of the Magdalene families have survived the pestilence in numbers that suggest divine protection or prior knowledge of the sickness." He doesn't elaborate, but in his private ledger, confiscated after his death, he notes, "They do not sicken as we do. I have seen this with my own eyes. It is as if they carry a different blood. Different blood." In 2003, a geneticist named Dr. Laurent Duval at the University of Lyon conducted mitochondrial DNA analysis on remains recovered from the Montségur ossuary and from 3 other sites in southern France associated with Magdalene legends. He discovered a unique haplogroup, rare in Europe but more common in Levantine populations, especially among first-century Jewish communities in Judea. He published his findings in a small academic journal. Within 6 months, his funding was revoked, his lab was closed, and he was offered a position at the Vatican Observatory. He declined. In a 2007 interview, he said only, "I was told that some questions are too dangerous to answer in public. But the evidence does not require a lab, it requires literacy." In 1890, a historian named Jules Michel examined the heresy trials of the 14th century and noticed a pattern. Women accused of witchcraft in France, particularly in Languedoc, were disproportionately questioned about their lineage and their mother's name. This was not standard Inquisition protocol. Standard protocol involved questions about pacts with demons, attendance at Sabbaths, and possession of forbidden texts. But in southern France, the question was always genealogical. Why? Because the Inquisition wasn't hunting witches, it was hunting descendants. In 1456, the trial of Marguerite Dürr in Toulouse reveals the mechanics of this hunt. She was accused of heresy not because of any theological claim, but because she possessed a handwritten family book listing the names of her maternal ancestors going back 11 generations. The book was confiscated and burned, but the charges against her included this line: "She claims descent from the woman who anointed the feet of the Lord and bore his children in exile." Marguerite wasn't tortured, and she wasn't burned. She was released on the condition that she never speak of her family history again, and that she take a new surname. She complied. Her new surname was Dufour of the Oven, a name that signified erasure, resetting her identity to a trade rather than a lineage. This pattern repeats across Europe. In 1520, in the Basque country, a woman named Maria Magdalena Etaria was brought before the Spanish Inquisition. She had done nothing heretical, she hadn't denied transubstantiation, and she hadn't questioned papal authority. Her crime was that her family had preserved, for 14 generations, a tradition that they descended from the Holy Companion who fled to the sea. The Inquisition demanded proof. She showed them a small silver reliquary containing a lock of red hair and a piece of parchment with a prayer in Aramaic. The reliquary was confiscated. Maria was released, but in the Inquisition archive in Madrid, her file contains a marginal note in Latin. If true, all authority is fiction. Because the entire architecture of Christian ecclesiology depends on the belief that Jesus left no biological heirs, that his authority passed through apostolic succession, through Peter, through Rome, through the sacraments. If he left children, if those children survived, if they carried forward not just memory but biology, then the Church's claim to be the sole mediator between God and humanity collapses. This isn't about theology, it's about legitimacy. This is about who owns the story of God. And the story doesn't end with the Inquisition. In 1789, during the French Revolution, when mobs ransacked churches and monasteries, something unexpected was found in the crypt of the Abbey of San Maxima in Provence. It was a sarcophagus sealed with lead, bearing an inscription in Greek. Here lies Mary, called Magdalene, who gave life after the resurrection. Inside were the remains of a woman, with fragments of red hair still visible, and a second inscription carved into the interior lid. She was the mother. The revolutionaries reburied the remains with honors. The inscription was recorded by multiple witnesses. In 1814, after the Restoration, the sarcophagus was opened again. The interior inscription had been chiseled off. Someone, in the chaos of war and regime change, had taken the time to erase 6 words from the inside of a stone coffin that no one was supposed to open. This wasn't vandalism, it was intentional removal of evidence, and it confirms a pattern that spans 2 millennia. Wherever the story of Magdalene's children surfaces, institutional power moves to suppress it, not by argument, not by counter-evidence, but by erasure. In 1945, at Nag Hammadi in Egypt, a collection of Gnostic Gospels was discovered, including the Gospel of Philip, which contains this line: "The companion of the Savior is Mary Magdalene. He loved her more than all the disciples and used to kiss her often on the mouth." Early church fathers dismissed this text as heretical, but they didn't dismiss it because it was false. They dismissed it because it suggested intimacy, partnership, and, by implication, family. In the Gospel of Mary, also found at Nag Hammadi, Peter asks, "Did he really speak privately with a woman and not openly with us?" The text doesn't answer Peter's question, but the fact that the question was asked and then the text was hidden for 1,600 years suggests the answer was too dangerous to preserve. In 1982, the same year, Pierre Plantard found the parchments in Paris. A small church in Kilmore, Scotland, underwent restoration. Behind a false wall, workers discovered a medieval fresco, badly damaged, but still partially visible. It depicted a woman with red hair holding a child, standing beside a man with a halo. The fresco was dated to the 13th century. Local tradition identified the church as having been founded by women who came from the sea. The fresco was photographed, documented, and then, on orders from the Diocese of Argyll, it was covered with plaster. It remains covered to this day. The official reason given was preservation. The unofficial reason, according to a diocese archivist who spoke anonymously in 1999, was, "We were told not to encourage pilgrimages based on speculation." Speculation. In 2011, a British filmmaker named Bruce Burgess released a documentary claiming that he had discovered, in the basement of a chateau near Rennes-la-Tau, a tomb containing the remains of a woman and a set of scrolls describing her as the wife of Yeshua. The discovery wasn't confirmed by academic authorities. The chateau was purchased by a private foundation shortly after the film's release and sealed to the public. Burgess was sued for trespassing and later died in a car accident. His footage was never independently verified, but the story spread. And once again, the response wasn't investigation, it was closure. What does it mean that every single time physical evidence appears, suggesting that Magdalene bore children, that evidence is sealed, dismissed, erased, or destroyed? What does it mean that the Inquisition asked genealogical questions of women accused of heresy? What does it mean that noble families in medieval Europe were investigated for claiming descent from the Magdalene line? What does it mean that genetic research into these claims is defunded and suppressed? It means this: the institutional Church has spent 2,000 years fighting not a theological debate, but a biological fact. Because if the children of Jesus survived, if they married, if they had children of their own, if that line continued through centuries of persecution, inquisition, war, and plague, then the authority of the Church isn't divine appointment, it's a political construction. And that construction depends entirely on erasing the women who carried the memory. The Daughters of Magdalene aren't legend. Their history written in disappearing ink. Their names that appear in one generation and vanish in the next. Their family trees that are burned, confiscated, or sealed in archives that open once a century. Their genetic markers that show up in unexpected places and are explained away as migration or coincidence. Their oral traditions in villages where no one writes anything down, because writing makes you visible, and visibility makes you a target. The bloodline didn't die. It hid, it scattered, it changed its name, it married into families that had no idea what they were protecting. It survived not because of divine intervention, but because erasure is never total, because archives are vast and bureaucrats are lazy, because inquisitors miss villages, because revolutions open crypts, because DNA doesn't care about theology. In 2018, a genealogist in Quebec traced her matrilineal ancestry back to a woman named Mélanie Broussard, who arrived in New France in 1669. Broussard's family records, preserved in the archives of Rouen, list her mother as Mélinde Saint-Maxima and her grandmother as Mélanie Davin. 3 generations of Madeleines, each one born in southern France, each one migrating farther from the centers of Inquisition power. The genealogist posted her findings on a public ancestry website. Within a week, her account was deleted. The stated reason was a violation of terms of service. No further explanation was provided. This is how the erasure continues, not with fire and interrogation, but with server farms and terms of service agreements. The tools change, the motive remains the same. Control the story, control the past, control the claim to sacred legitimacy. Because if the Daughters of Magdalene are real, if their descendants walk the earth today, if they carry in their cells the genetic memory of a woman who loved a man the world now calls God, then 2,000 years of doctrine collapses into what it always was. A power structure built on the graves of women who knew too much. The records survived, the memory survived, the blood survived. They rewrote the story, but they never killed the evidence. What they feared most was never myth. It was history refusing to die. It was daughters remembering their mothers' names. It was family trees written in the margins of censored texts. It was the possibility that divinity doesn't pass through institutions, but through the ordinary, unstoppable fact of children being born. They tried to erase her. They erased her 1,000 times. And still, in village churches across Europe, in hidden frescoes and forbidden gospels, in ossuaries and genetic sequences, in the persistence of a name that will not disappear, she endures. Not as a saint, not as a prostitute, not as the repentant sinner the Church needed her to be, but as what she always was, a woman who loved, who fled, who gave birth in exile, and whose daughters carried forward the most dangerous truth in Christian history, that God was human and that his humanity didn't end on a cross. It continued in the bodies of children no one was supposed to remember.